Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today. Now I've had some comments and questions on the Kennewick Man, and I thought that was a great idea for my Ancient America series, and I have looked into this in the past. So we're going to go down to Kennewick, Washington today, and this is an area of Washington that Randall Carlson has talked about in his Scabland flooding videos, and if you have not watched those are pretty eye-opening here. Some flooding that we really cannot even imagine. But we're going to talk about a find that was made in Kennewick, Washington in 1996, and this is the exact spot. But in 1996, right in the spot, a skull was found just slightly offshore, and they determined, later studies on the rest of the bones that were found, that this gentleman was buried intentionally, and possibly maybe his head was turned towards the west. That seemed to be common in a lot of practices, but right here is where he was found. This is Clover Island, Wade Island. This, I'm not sure what the name of the bridge is here, but this is right where he was found, and who knows what the riverway looked like at that time. But we're going to talk about this and the controversy, and I'll just leave it up to you in the comment section to add what you know. Now this comes from the Burke Museum, where the Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One, was kept for almost 20 years. And this comes from February of 2017. It says, Statement on the Reparation of the Ancient One. On Friday, February 17, 2017, the remains of the Ancient One, otherwise known as Kennewick Man, were returned to the tribes who claim him as their ancestor. The Burke Museum provided secure and respectful curation of the Ancient One from 1998 to 2017 under contract to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the government agency that controlled the remains until they were reparated. The return of the Ancient One to the tribes is the right decision and was long overdue. It is consistent with the Burke's commitment to both legal and ethical principles of this law right here, 6-letter title law here, federal law that allows tribes to reclaim human remains and cultural items from museums and other institutions. The Burke Museum values our long-standing relationship with the tribes, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and looks forward to continued partnership in accordance with our mission as the Washington State Museum of Natural History and Culture. And here is the spot where Kennewick Man was found. But who was the Ancient One, also known as Kennewick Man? It says, on July 28, 1996, 2 men at Columbia Park at Kennewick, Washington, accidentally found part of a human skull at the bottom of the Columbia River about 10 feet from shore. Later searches revealed a nearly complete ancient skeleton, now known as the Ancient One or Kennewick Man. Public interest, debate, and controversy began when independent archaeologist Dr. James Chatters, working on a contract with the Benton County coroner, thought that the bones might not be Native American, and he called them Caucasoid, and sent a piece of a bone to a laboratory to be dated. The result indicated an age older than 9,000 years, making the Ancient One among the oldest and most complete skeletons ever found in North America. Subsequent research on the bones indicated that the skeleton is between 8,400 and 8,690 years old, and this just unleashed, over a decade of controversy that was finally settled in 2017 when the Ancient One was buried in a private ceremony. And here is a facial reconstruction of Kennewick Man. But it says, shortly after the remains were discovered, a group of scholars sued the federal government, representing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which managed the land where the remains were found, to prevent the remains from being returned to the tribes under the Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act, and that is NAGPRA. It says that passed in 1990, and that provides legal protections for Native American human remains, including their return to tribal communities, if the tribes can prove that they are related to the remains. And this really got involved, this controversy, and I know there was plenty said on this, so if you are familiar with this story and want to leave any comment, please do. The scientists argued that the remains were not proven to be related to present-day tribes, therefore they should not be subject to NAGPRA, this law, and should be available to the scientific community for study. Several Washington and Oregon tribes joined the federal government in defending the suit. Just finishing up with this Burke Museum, it says, while the remains were cared for by the Burke Museum, and that's in Seattle, I believe, the museum was not involved in research conducted on the remains, and the ancient one was never displayed. The remains were kept in a private, secure location at the Burke Museum. But it says the findings published in the journal Nature in June determined the validity of the skull measurements in determining a race, a practice long questioned by the scientific community. You cannot assign an individual to a specific geographic group based on a skull shape. And it goes on to say some of the paper's collaborators studied Native American skulls from similar geographic groups and found that there was too much variation within populations to determine geographic origin for a single skull. Other studies suggested Kennewick Man was more closely related to either Polynesians or the Ainu people of Japan than he was to indigenous North Americans, indicating the early arrival of Asiatic peoples to the continent. But genetic testing now appears to have settled the question of his race, and it says DNA from a finger bone remnant indicates that his closest modern-day relatives are Native Americans, specifically the Colville tribes of eastern Washington. Now, this is a website from NPR, and they did a story on this a while back. But it seems, to wrap it up, it was assumed Caucasian at first, just on some bad old assumptions made by the scientific community. And then it was hinted at that he maybe had Polynesian or Asian descent. But then it says here, finally, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers confirmed that the ancient bearer of the bones is genetically linked to modern-day Native Americans. Now, under federal law, a group of tribes that has been fighting to rebury him will almost certainly get to do so. And this was written before his reburial. It also means that the scientists will probably never get another chance to study him, though ancient human remains found from North America are incredibly rare, and forensic technology gets better all the time. It's a chafe between science and spirituality, writes Kevin Taylor at Indian Country Today, between people who say the remains have so much to tell us about the ancient human past that they should remain available for research, versus people who feel kinship with the ancient bones and say that they should be reburied to show proper reverence for the dead. But that study revealing that his closest modern-day relatives are Native Americans, does that really answer where his ancestors came from? But it says DNA evidence also complicated an old question. Who were the first Americans? Although Nielsen's study suggests a single migration, a recent Harvard study found genetic similarities between native Amazonian tribes and Aboriginal populations in Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. Harvard's study concluded these genes likely arrived with a now extinct common ancestor in a separate migration. That had to happen a very long time ago, when really the standard model history says people were not traveling over the oceans. But a little facts about Kennewick Man. He had a couple old wounds, including a projectile point in his hip that had kind of, the bone had kind of grown over, so it was obviously an old wound. But it talks about James Chatters' visits to the site here. It says Chatters managed to collect 350 more bones and fragments, which completed almost an entire skeleton. The cranium was fully intact and all teeth from the time of death. All the major bones were found except the sternum and a few in the hands and feet. After studying the bones, Chatters concluded they belonged to a male, late middle age, 40 to 55 years old, 170 to 176 centimeters tall, which is 5'7" to 5'9", and was fairly muscular with a slender build. So there was a lot of questions here. Who was this guy? How old was he? What group of people did he belong to? Where did he come from? And then, of course, what to do with the remains. And this is where it got to be a very sticky subject. Of course, if you think this guy is related to your people, you consider his remains very sacred. And just imagine if it was your relative. And then also there are the scientists who want to determine what happened in our ancient past. So where do you kind of toe the line and make both sides happy? Well, it's pretty hard to do and almost impossible. Well, what finally became of this story? This is Live Science from about 2.5 years ago, and they did a story on the burial. the reburial of Kennewick Man. And some of you may remember another artist's rendition or reconstruction of the face. Some of you may remember this. This is a facial reconstruction, another one done without the hair or the beard. And some said this looked like Patrick Stewart. Thousands of years after his death, an ancient skeleton known as the Kennewick Man has finally been laid to rest. On Friday, February 17th, the bones and belongings of the Ancient One were handed over to the representatives of the Umatilla, Yakima Nation, Nez Perce tribe, and Confederate tribes of the Colville Reservation and the Wanapum Band of Indians, the Seattle Times reported. The ancient remains were then placed in an undisclosed burial site near the Columbia River, which flows through parts of Washington and Oregon. But that is the story of Kennewick Man. Pretty fascinating find. Pretty much fully intact skeleton that was intentionally buried. But to get to the full story of ancient America, we are just getting to that these days, in these times now, what actually happened to that fascinating, multi-layered story that goes back who knows how many thousands of years. Well, I think you have to look at all the stories you can find that seem to be important and then put them all together. But this seems one that needs to be told in my Ancient America series. But an almost 9,000-year-old skeleton found here in a part of the world that went through some tremendous flooding, maybe a few thousand years before that. But I just thought this story needed to be told in my Ancient America series. Hope you thought that was interesting. You all have a very nice day.